My own children packed my suitcase while I was still asleep, and by the time I opened my eyes, my son was already calling me a cab to a nursing home I never agreed to. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 71 years old. And for the last 6 years, I have lived a lie so quiet, so careful, that not even my own children suspected it. I was a schoolteacher for 38 years. I taught 3rd grade in a small brick building in Ohio, the kind of building where the radiators clank in winter and the windows fog up during snow days. I drove a 2009 Bic with a cracked side mirror. I clipped coupons. I wore the same wool coat every winter because I told everyone I just liked it too much to replace it. That was the story I let my children believe. The truth was that 6 years earlier, my late husband Robert, a quiet man who ran a small parts manufacturing company most people had never heard of, had signed a licensing deal 3 months before he died that turned our modest little company into something else entirely. Something worth more money than either of us ever imagined. I never touched it. I never spent it. I kept living exactly as I always had, in the same small house on Maple Street, because I wanted to see who my children would become when they thought there was nothing left to inherit. I have 2 children. David, 44, an insurance salesman with a mortgage he can't quite afford, and a wife, Denise, who redecorates their living room every time she's unhappy about something else. And Grace, 41, who calls me twice a year, Mother's Day and my birthday, and always ends the call the same way: "I really have to run, Mom." I loved them both. I still do. That's the part nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't kill the love. It just breaks something next to it. It started on a Tuesday in March. I remember because the daffodils were just starting to come up along my front walk, and I was standing at the stove making oatmeal when David let himself in with his spare key. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, not looking at me. Denise stood behind him in the doorway, arms crossed, staring at my kitchen like she was pricing it for a garage sale. "The house needs too much work," David said. "The stairs aren't safe for you anymore. We found a place. Sunrise Manor. It's nice, Mom." "Really?" I set down my spoon. "You found a place," I repeated, without asking me. "We're doing what's best for you," Denise said, in the voice people use when they've already made a decision and are only pretending to ask. I looked at my son's face and searched for the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during Sunday sermons. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That was the first 30 seconds of the end of the life I had built to protect them from themselves. It would not be the last. 3 days later, Grace called. Not to check on me, to tell me she agreed with David. "It's for your own good, Mom. You're not as sharp as you used to be." I hadn't forgotten a single appointment, a single bill, a single birthday in my life. But grief does strange things to memory, and apparently so does greed. I didn't fight them. That was my mistake, or perhaps my strategy, even I wasn't sure which yet. I let them believe I had nothing left but a small pension and a paid-off house they were already circling like it was the last item at an estate sale. I packed 1 suitcase. I left behind the wedding china, the photo albums, the armchair Robert used to fall asleep in during football games. David didn't offer to keep any of it for me. He mentioned, almost too casually, that he'd already spoken to a realtor about getting ahead of the market. 2 weeks. That's how long it took him to list my house after driving me to Sunrise Manor. Sunrise Manor smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables. My room had a window that faced the parking lot. I sat on the edge of a stiff twin bed that first night and, for the first time since Robert's funeral, I let myself cry. But grief, I've learned, has a shelf life. And underneath mine, something else was quietly hardening. I made 1 phone call. Not to my children. To a man named Arthur Kessler, the attorney who had handled Robert's estate from the very beginning. The only person alive who knew the truth about what we were actually worth. "Eleanor," he said, "are you ready?" "I think," I said slowly, "it's time they found out who I really am." Here is the secret nobody in my family knew. 6 years ago, after Robert died, I didn't inherit a small manufacturing company. I inherited controlling shares in a supplier that, through a licensing deal Robert signed weeks before his death, became a critical parts vendor for 2 Fortune 500 automotive manufacturers. I never sold. I never cashed out. I let a trusted board run it quietly under my maiden name, Eleanor Marsh, while I kept teaching, kept clipping coupons, kept living in a house that was, on paper, worth less than the watch on my son-in-law's wrist. I did this for one reason. I wanted to know, before I died, whether my children loved me, or loved what they assumed I'd eventually leave them. Now I had my answer. And I intended to make sure they heard it in a room where they couldn't look away. Arthur called a family meeting 2 weeks later. He told David and Grace it concerned the final settlement of your mother's affairs. David showed up in a suit he clearly bought for the occasion, already talking about next steps before he'd even sat down. Grace brought her husband, a man I'd met exactly 4 times, presumably in case there was furniture to divide. I sat at the head of the conference table. My hands were folded. My spine was straight. I had worn my good navy dress, the one I usually saved for Easter. "Before we begin," Arthur said, opening a leather folder, "I think it's important everyone understands exactly what is being distributed today." He read the figure. I watched my son's face go the color of old paper. "That's not possible," David said. "Mom lived in she drove that car doesn't even have working AC." "Your mother," Arthur said calmly, "has been the majority shareholder of Marsh Industrial Holdings since your father's passing. Current valuation, as of this quarter, places her personal net worth at just under $31 million. The silence in that room was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. Grace's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Mom, why would you let us think?" "Because I needed to know," I said quietly, "what you would do if you believed I had nothing left to give you." Nobody spoke. David's wife, Denise, who had priced my kitchen for a garage sale, stared at the table like it might rescue her. I won't pretend the rest was simple. There was no scene where I sold my house back or moved into some grand estate to prove a point. That's not how real healing works, and I refuse to lie to you now the way I let my children believe a lie for 6 years. I stayed at Sunrise Manor for 3 more months, by choice, this time. I made friends there. A retired mechanic named Walter who taught me to play gin rummy badly and laughed every time I lost. A woman named Ruth who'd buried 2 husbands and still found reasons to put on lipstick every morning. I learned something in that building I never expected to learn. That dignity doesn't come from an address. It comes from how honestly you're allowed to live. David called every week after that. Not asking for anything, just talking. About his job, about his fear that he'd built his whole identity around what he thought he'd someday inherit. It took him the better part of a year to say the words "I'm sorry, Mom, and I don't need anything from you" to mean it. When he finally did, I believed him, because he never once asked about the money again. Grace and I are still rebuilding. Some bridges you can't rush. She sends photos now. Small ones, her garden, her dog, nothing performative. It's slower than I'd like. But it's real, and real is worth waiting for. I used a portion of the estate to fund scholarships for retired teachers pursuing second careers. Women like me, who spent their lives giving and were never taught to ask for anything back. I kept the house on Maple Street. I had the stairs repaired, not replaced. I still make oatmeal on Tuesdays. People ask me if I regret the test. If I regret letting my children believe, even for a little while, that their mother had nothing left. I don't. Because the truth is, money never tells you who someone really is. It's the absence of money that does that. Anyone can love you when they think you're worth something. The rarer thing, the thing worth building a life around, is being loved by someone who thinks you have nothing left to give. That's the inheritance I was really looking for. And in the end, it's the only one that mattered.